Well, hello and welcome to another interview on the Catholic Pulse. My name is Robert Cahoon. I'm really honoured and blessed today to be with Father Andrew Pinsent, who is an incredibly intelligent priest. He is the research director of the Inranti Centre for Science and Religion, based at the University of Oxford. He's also a research fellow at Harris Manchester College, and he's a priest of the Diocese of Arundel Brighton as well. I'm just looking at your educational qualifications, Father Andrew, just an incredible background that you've had being a physicist, involved at the Delphi project at CERN, many publications, and how many degrees, Father, do you actually have in total? I think, have you lost count or?
I think it's between 5 and 7. I don't quite know exactly. It depends how many you want to count, really, but it's just I spent a long time in higher education, one way or another. And I still regard myself as a beginner.
It's just amazing the career that you've had, and you're currently based in Oxford as well. Could you just sort of give us a background to your studies, how you first of all your PhDs and how you came to become a priest as well, just a sort of summary of your personal life and background?
Yes, so as a teenager, I was a bit of a nerd, and I was hugely excited by science, all kinds of science, but particularly astronomy and particle physics. When I was growing up, the Voyager space missions were in progress. In fact, they're still in progress. And every few years, another planet would appear that's never been seen properly before, with all its moons. And it was a tremendously exciting time. And I was just really in love with scientific research, but I didn't know which science to choose. So I came to the conclusion, if I studied physics, then I could later study any science. So, which was actually quite a sound instinct. So I went to Oxford to study physics, and I became interested not so much in outer space, but in inner space, the world of the atom, which is at least as big as outer space in terms of all the different worlds to explore. Having finished my undergraduate degree, I applied for a doctorate, also at Oxford, and a doctorate in particle physics. Oxford at that time was building equipment for the Large Electron Positron Collider in Geneva. It was in the same tunnel as the current Large Hadron Collider. The tunnel is enormous. It's 27 kilometers in circumference, and it does amazing things. It smashes matter and antimatter together, nearly at the speed of light, to get as much energy into a smaller space as possible. And when that happens, we see underlying symmetries in the laws of nature. We can see how things fit together in a sort of the pure and simple state of the Big Bang. And often we can discover the underlying principles of the laws of physics governing the universe today. So I worked on that experiment. It was a lot of fun, a lot of hard work. And after that, I thought I'd been sated, really. 3 years of designing equipment, testing equipment in Geneva, writing software, working out data. Mm-hmm. And I thought I wanted to change. So I spent 7 years in business, 3 years working for a consultancy firm in England. Then I got bored with that as well. Excuse me. And then 4 years, I really set up my own business. And I worked as a consultant for a company in Brazil called Itatec Filco. And I used to go out to Sao Paulo. I think it's, by the way, very important for people with some Western business experience to spend time in developing countries, because one's expertise is very much valued and very helpful. So I did that for 4 years. And then I had a call to become a priest. And being a businessman, I rationalized it in business terms. I did a cost-benefit analysis, which is the sort of standard heuristic one uses before making a business decision.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it's going to cost me my life, but the potential fruitfulness is enormous, because I was already convinced that our main task of life is to know and love God, and to be fruitful in this life, knowing and loving God. And the work of a priest I won't describe it as being a bridge. That's too grand. But I'll describe it as being a doormat. So a priest is to be a doormat to the kingdom of heaven for other people. And that seems like a best possible return on my investment. But I had no idea what to do. I had no idea where priests came from. So I spoke to our local priest, and he said, "Well, you've got to talk to a bishop." So I approached the bishop secretary of my diocese. I was interviewed between 7 and 9 times. I can't remember exactly how many times.
Wow.
It was a long process. I joked at the end. I said, "I've never worked so hard to earn so little." But anyway, I was accepted for training, and I started training at the Venerable English College in Rome, which was tough. Imagine going to another country, studying philosophy in Italian. That's with starting from zero. That was how it was. That's how my seminary experience started. But I loved philosophy, even if it wasn't taught always very well. And I thought, why has no one taught me this before? I've trained to smash particles in Geneva. No one's taught me the history of Western thought. No one's taught me the history of ideas, of how we think about the world. And I thought, this is amazing. I love philosophy. I still love philosophy. And in the course of my training to be a priest, I studied 4 years of philosophy. Then a professor arrived from the United States called Eleanor Stump. And Professor Stump said to me, "I will get you funding to do a doctorate with me in America." And I said, "Well, that sounds good, but I don't decide my future. My bishop decides my future." So she contacted my bishop, and after that conversation, he phoned me and said, "You are going to America." So 1 week after ordination, I was in the American Midwest in Missouri, and I was studying another 4 years of philosophy. So now that's 8 years philosophy altogether. And that was quite life-changing. So Eleanor Stump taught me how to write for often a much more secular audience than I was used to, and that was very important. And then a job came up in Oxford. They were really looking for someone with philosophy, theology, science, and business background.
Wow.
I thought, oh, this may be the last job in the world I can still do. So my diocese kindly released me to study, to go to Oxford, and I've been there ever since, for about 11 years now.
Wow, fantastic. And it puts you in a very good, not only being a priest, but also being a scientist. What do you say to people who say, isn't the church anti-science? And, from your position, that's quite easy to refute, but there are so many misconceptions and assumptions in the idea that the church is anti-science. Right. So how do you deconstruct that argument?
Well, first of all, one has to appreciate one's dealing with a very powerful prejudice that's got to be confronted. And the problem is the prejudice impacts even on our 10-year-olds. So if I visit a school, often some 10 or 11-year-old will tell me that I'm anti-science, and I say, well, that's interesting. What does the word faith mean? Well, they don't know. I said, what is science? They don't know that either. But they do know that faith is against science. So they've picked up that prejudice, even though they don't know what is meant by either faith or science. If they're older children, they might confront me on a particular issue. So they might say, well, how can I be a priest and believe in the Big Bang Theory? Mm-hmm. And of course, when they say that, I'm sort of rubbing my hands with excitement, because I can then tell them that a priest invented the Big Bang Theory. I showed them a picture of Georges Lemaitre with Albert Einstein. Georges Lemaitre was the Belgian priest and astrophysicist who solved Einstein's equations of general relativity to predict universal expansion, and he showed how it could be tested. It was tested a few years later by a man called Edwin Hubble, after whom the Hubble Space Telescope is named. So it's very strange if the church is anti-science that we've had people like Georges Lemaitre, and we've had others. Perhaps if your listeners and viewers don't mind me going through a few names. So look at genetics. Genetics is the most important theory of modern biology. And That started with a monk in the 19th century breeding 29,000 pea plants, as one does. Imagine going out to monastery gardens and start breeding 29,000 pea plants. And he worked out what we now call the laws of genetics. It's called Mendelian genetics. That's Greek or Mendel. And here's another one. The narrative today is often the church is sort of held women back, or being anti-women. I bet very few people know the first woman professor of mathematics, Maria Agnesi, was appointed by a pope, Pope Benedict XIV, and was appointed in 1750. To put that achievement in retrospect, into perspective, the first woman to get a PhD in mathematics in the United States was not till nearly the end of the 19th century, nearly 150 years later. And Maria Agnesi, an exceptional woman, but she wasn't alone. The first woman to get a doctoral degree was Eleanor Piscopia. She was a Venetian Catholic. And in fact, I remember when I was at CERN in Geneva, which is a sort of a huge international melting pot for scientists from many different countries. But the Southern Europeans had a lot more women. So, even today, the state of women in science in Catholic countries has actually often been rather good and probably somewhat ahead of the Northern European, more traditionally Protestant countries.
So, Father, you're really from a long list of sort of Catholic clergy who are also scientists, from Copernicus to Mendel to Roger Bacon,
Yes.
Lemaitre, William Moroccan. So there's quite a long tradition of priests who are also scientists as well. I remember the last interview I did with you. We were talking about your booklet, the Lumen, which really kind of goes deep into this kind of. I remember there was a debate going back 10 years ago with, what good has the Catholic Church done kind of in society, and it very much the Catholic position lost that debate on the BBC. But in the booklet Lumen, you really just go into detail. What has the Church done for society, and in so many different fields. There's just a long list of benefits, which comprehensively you deal with that in that booklet.
Yes, well, the fact is, the BBC was sort of it provides a sort of an object lesson for that. The world is not fair about such things, and the BBC, who seem to be pretty ignorant to me, every encounter I have with them is they're pretty ignorant, but they also have very little actual science background. They don't recruit many scientists, and their narrative is that the church must be against science. Now, that debate you talked about,
Anne Widdecombe, and it was a Nigerian archbishop, and Stephen Fry, and I think Christopher Hitchens.
So they got Stephen Fry and Christopher Hitchens, who are very skilled in the modern media, and they got a Nigerian bishop, Anne Widdecombe. Why were these two chosen? I don't know. It was a complete setup. The whole thing was a setup. But you can't trust the BBC. And I'll give you another example. So some years ago, there was a program on the Big Bang. And there was a presenter the BBC likes a lot. I can't remember his name offhand, but it may come to me. But they had a 1-hour presentation on Big Bang, and they didn't mention Georges Lemaitre. Which is a bit like giving a presentation on a presentation on relativity without mentioning Einstein. So it's really come home to you can't trust these people. Fortunately, thanks to your own work and there's many others, the monopolies have been partly broken in terms of the media. So we can educate ourselves. I'm always struck with just how good so much material on YouTube is. I was watching a series recently on geography, and there's a group who've gone through every country in the world, and just a potted summary, and it's fantastic. I thought, all uploaded for free. It's you've got to be a bit critical of some things sometimes, but we have a tremendous advantage today in terms of the diversity of media, and and gradually the old monopolies are being broken.
So if you were in that debate, that BBC debate, what would have said? What good has the Catholic Church done for society and, across the board, art, architecture,
Well,
science? Yeah.
I would try to make the point that the whole of what we term Western civilization, it's a bit of a controversial phrase in itself, but it's really a byproduct of Christians seeking heaven. And if you think that's exaggerated, where did all our art come from? Now, our art, one of the things that makes Christianity a bit different, to say the least, from other kinds of religions is the belief in the incarnation and the concretely given supernatural. The Word has made flesh. And with that, then one could depict God in paint and on statues, and with statues without blasphemy. And that gave rise to an enormous impetus in the visual arts, because it's a way of sort of continuing the sense of the concretely given supernatural. And really, that was the main driving force for art for 1,000 years. Here's another thing. So where did our music come from? Where did our musical notation system come from? If you're a monk in a monastery 1,000 years ago and you want to sing in unison with your fellow monks, you have to sing from the same hymn sheet. But first of all, you've got to invent hymn sheets, and that also comes out of the Catholic Church. Where did our laws come from? And all kinds of principles, like principle of good faith, the principle of trial by jury, the principle of innocent until proven guilty. And that's really under pressure today, innocent until proven guilty. But these are all Catholic principles from the High Middle Ages. Our Western legal system comes from, starts really with canon law nearly 1,000 years ago. And you can go through many, many other fields. Where did our universities come from? I'm at Oxford. Now, Oxford is actually one of our oldest universities in the world. And because of that, it's got a lot of really, really ancient buildings. And all these are obviously Catholic buildings. They've got Gothic. The Gothic architectural style is praying. It's pointing upwards. And it's the precise opposite of brutalism. And all the older buildings at Oxford are Gothic, because they're designed by Catholics. And almost all the colleges have chapels where the Blessed Sacrament was offered. Again, because this is a Catholic institution. But most beautifully of all, Oxford's really puzzling. And I've been at Oxford now for how many years is it? About 16 years in total.
Yeah.
I still don't know how it works. Now, and no one else does. It's really a set of interlocking medieval guilds. And now you might think that's a disadvantage. A university where you can't understand how the university works, but it's a massive advantage because the evil minds can't get into the center of things and destroy it.
They can't deconstruct it like
they can't deconstruct it. It's very hard to deconstruct it. Well, the people are trying, of course.
Yeah.
But it's really a set of interlocking medieval guilds, and it's like a garden and a machine.
It's great.
And in a garden, you can wander through and pick up unusual blossoms that are cross-fertilized from different plants. And that's why Oxford is still a place where original ideas come from. And it's very hard to replicate that. It's very hard to produce a university that's like a machine and still produces good ideas. I was discussing I just had a tutorial with a student a few minutes ago, and we were discussing how when companies build corporate headquarters, almost always that's the death knell, because they're going to turn themselves into machines and produce no new ideas. But Oxford's not like that. It's a very decentralized set of medieval guilds, and it still produces original ideas. So at the moment, there are vaccines against COVID in the world, and Oxford's the only university with its name attached to one of those vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with your background, Father, of science, faith, religion, and business as well, you've also written the Y course as well, and that's a kind of a 101 introduction to Catholicism of philosophy. Tell us about the Y course and the kind of the basic premises in it.
Right. So the Y course aims to do something impossible. It should introduce Catholic Christianity in 3 lessons. That's and you could write libraries about the Catholic faith and all its cultural impact and so on. But you've got to start somewhere. So if you can, so what we tried to do was get things down to just 3 sessions, a maximum of 1 hour each, which we thought would be enough to give a basic introduction. And there are 3 sections: why God, why Christ, and why the Church. And what we try to do is try to get through just the basics. It is quite a philosophically oriented course, so but not using jargon. So so we try to anticipate what sort of questions people ask. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there order rather than disorder in the world? And try to encourage people to think about the world around them and the purposes of their lives. What we did initially is we interviewed a lot of young people at the Evangelium conference, and then we spliced the interviews together into 3 narratives covering why God, why Christ, and why the Church. So the narratives give it a sense of freshness. We allowed the text to develop organically. We didn't try to write it all ourselves from scratch. We used the replies of these young people to these questions, and then we put them into a coherent narrative.
Fantastic. And did you use artwork in that? Because in the Evangelium course, you had quite a lot of arts, sort of as catechesis as well, or was
yes,
that part
there's a lot of art used, and the Catholic faith is the great faith of art more than anything else. Catholic pictures represent the human face and the hands, and also there's spectacular things from nature. So we talked about Georges Lemaitre earlier. I mean, he appears along with Albert Einstein, as does Gregor Mendel, and we also use pictures from William Blake, and there's Mary Magdalene. I'll just have a look now. Yes, we use a few samples from classical works. I'm rather fond of The Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. Now, Bosch is, I remember when I studied art briefly at school, and at school they describe the history of art starting from when it became secular. And when that's it. It's when it became secular. It's when the history of art starts in our schools. There's 1,000 years. There are many thousand years before then. There's 1,000 years of Christian art before then, but it's not talked about, generally speaking. And I remember when they got to surrealism, they presented surrealism as something new. But they had to admit that Hieronymus Bosch, back in the 15th century, came up with something far more extraordinary than surrealism, with his Garden of Earthly Delights and other works.
Pretty spectacular picture.
Yes, indeed. There's so much theology in it. Yes, yes. So what else we got here? Obviously, we also show the precursors of Christianity. We invite people to think, why are so many cities built around temples? There's a natural religious impulse.
You help to really deal with the crisis of catechesis, with the Y course and also Evangelium as well, because so many Catholics just don't know their faith at all, and we've been lacking a really good catechesis for well over 50 years, and
right.
at least getting people to really think deeply about why God, like just the most basic sort of 101 questions about our faith can really
Yeah.
help sort of answer those questions. And I can't imagine what it's like working at CERN, sort of bashing particles together, or what it must be like. But having a sense of awe and wonder about our faith, and bringing that open for a wider audience, just helping people to have a sense of amazement. And I think that's probably the great interface between science and religion, is that there's mystery, discovery, antiquity, just all combined in one, and they do sort of overlap in a way, but also complement each other, and they aren't
Yes.
necessarily divorced or against from each other. And that's a great sort of position where you're at. What was it like working at CERN? It must have been what does everyone do at CERN all day? They sort of bash particles together, or how does it work there?
It's a funny mix.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with very high technology in one sense. We're also doing really low technology, and almost jokingly low tech. So I remember testing whether some equipment is working by lowering a radioactive source on a fishing rod down the side of a detector, and then go back to the control room and seeing if there's a spike or not. And that's working, or not. And some of it's not very glamorous. So we were testing 6,000 gas connections, all of which have been supplied by the lowest cost supplier, looking for leaks, that sort of thing. So there is this quite mundane work. And I'm very glad my father taught me a bit of plumbing when I was growing up, and it gave me quite useful working in high tech physics. There's a lot of software. The software is as much work goes into software as hardware. We have to build a software replica of an entire particle detector. That's part of what's needed for the analysis, and that's a staggering amount of work. As much as effort goes into the software as into the hardware. So there's a lot of mundane stuff, but the big picture stuff is quite transcendent and quite awesome. But I want to explain the impact of that. Let me give you a slightly different story.
Mm-hmm.
So a few years ago, I met a Mexican astronaut. Now, I didn't know Mexico had astronauts exactly, but they do, a few. Or they are Mexican immigrants to the United States who later joined NASA. And there's a man who, at the age of 12, was picking fruit in California, a very poor background. And at the age of 12, he saw the last moon landing on a grainy black and white television, and he told his parents, "I want to be an astronaut," which is, doesn't look too likely if you're picking fruit in California, dirt poor, at the age of 12. But he was absolutely determined, and he worked himself up to get advanced education. He became a doctor of engineering, and then he started applying to NASA. And it's an amazing story of persistence, because they get about 10,000 applicants a year. This was during the shuttle program, so there were some places for astronauts. 10,000 applicants a year, and every year he failed. And then he began to get smart. So you think, well, what do the winning astronauts have? And he realized they all knew how to fly. Right. Next year, he'd always had to fly. He got all the certificates, everything. He still failed. And then he looked again at the successful astronauts. He also realized they all knew how to dive. So that following year, he taught himself to dive. He got all the certificates, everything. Right. So now he's a doctor of engineering, fully qualified pilot, fully qualified diver. He still fails. And then he realizes NASA's going to work a lot with Russia in the future. So he goes off to Russia. He learns fluent Russian. He works on nuclear decommissioning work in Russia in the early days after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now he's got Russian as well, and a lot of Russian collaborative experience. And the second time he tried, he was shortlisted. And the second time he was shortlisted, he was successful. What an amazing story. Now, I had to ask him, what was it like going into space? And after all this amazing work to get there, and he said it changed his life spiritually.
Wow.
Because when he saw the stars above the Earth's atmosphere, the stars in all their clarity, he was awestruck, and he thought there has to be a God.
Wow.
And he left Earth as a nominal Catholic. He came back as a man of deep faith.
Wow.
It's a rather expensive way to get people to become committed to their faith, but it's something to think about. We don't see the stars very much as people today.
Yeah.
And it's, the 19th century popes were concerned about this. So there was a man called Pope Gregory the 16th who stopped streetlights coming to Rome because people will not be able to see the stars. Now his successor, the relatively liberal Pius IX, allows streetlights, but the fact they realized there was an issue is significant, because we can't see the big world so much anymore. We're actually in quite a small world in terms of our daily lives, and that's one way. That's one way in which science, if you like, real science, promotes faith, because it really expands the mind, and it's very natural to have a sense of awe when engaging with that. Now, I'm not talking about the pop scientists who appear on television. Many of whom are not really scientists, or haven't produced many publications for many decades. But people that actually gain the science is actually often quite the sense of awe inspired by engaging with the physical world is often, not always, but often can make people receptive to faith.
And so, where is it in the science that, we've got this amazing awe and wonder that can help lead people to God? So, where in your mind is it science that has taken people away from God? How does that happen, and how does that, how is that how has this division between religion and science happened? Is it sort of an unnatural science? Because you're saying that science does lead people to God, and appreciating the stars, the wonder in that. Where is it that science has drifted off? Is it from philosophy, from scientism? Is it from just the developments in philosophy, or is it just becoming engrossed in our own world and having a secular materialist outlook?
I think the last one is most important, and in fact, this was understood by Aldous Huxley when he wrote the book Brave New World, which is a very prophetic book about our own age, really. And in Brave New World, people are kept busy all day long with pointless activities, recreational sex, work that doesn't really do anything. They're surrounded with pipe music. They play silly games, and they do that till they die.
Sounds like
exactly. Now, now, what's very fascinating is that the main characters in the story, they meet the man who's one of the controllers of the Brave New World towards the end of the book, and he says something interesting about God. He says there's probably a God, but we're not interested. We keep people busy, so they never have time to think about these things. And this man, he keeps Newman's works and the Bible locked up in his safe. So he's one of the very people who have these books, but so people don't get a chance to think about these ideas. That's the biggest challenge we face. It's not science. Science itself is the friend of faith, and science tends to lead to, and the very exploration of the natural world is an exploration of God's handiwork, and the proper engagement with the natural world produces humility, which is itself very important for faith. But the scientific world we live in is very good at distracting us. And this is, again, by the way, this is not a new, this was recognized by the ancient Greeks. So have you heard of Plato's myth of the cave?
Yeah.
Plato's myth of the cave. So in the Republic, book 7, Plato, through the character of Socrates, describes human beings as prisoners in a cave, and they're compelled to watch the shadows of the puppets of real things on the walls of the cave, the shadows cast by puppets behind their heads, and the whole battle for wisdom, according to Plato, is to get out of that cave and see the sun.
Hmm.
Now, a few years ago, I went to Hollywood. I sat on the set of Friends. It could have been any other show. But I suddenly realized this is Plato's cave for the 21st century. And the challenge we face is that people are trapped in that cave. Because if they see nothing but the shadows of puppets of real things projected on their walls, then it's unlikely they're going to acquire wisdom or practice of faith.
Yeah. And what are you working on at the moment, and what plans do you have for the near future, Father? What's sort of coming up for you in the next few years?
One thing I really want to do before I die is write a decent confirmation course.
Okay.
And that's my biggest single personal project. And I realized that one challenge would be that there isn't classical art available. So there are only 2 or 3 pictures ever of Pentecost. And the modern art, or the modern, and including in religious books, is often very poor. So I spent about 1.5 years finding someone who could do decent art and who could represent Catholic truth well. I found her. She's an American artist in California, and she is painting a series of 10 pictures, which will be for a confirmation course based on the Beatitudes. So there are 8 Beatitudes. We'll have an extra module at the beginning, an extra module at the end. 10 sessions about what I think anyone can cope with in a year. And the art will be original art. That's both traditional but very up to date as well. So, and one of the fun things is that there are lots of good computer models available. So, for example, there are computer games where you've got zombies running through medieval churches, that sort of thing. So lots of models of medieval churches, a lot of models of angels, there are lots of models of you can buy a model of Notre Dame before it's burned for a few dollars. And I've got someone in this country to do to use these 3-dimensional models to mock up the pictures, and then they go to California for painting. So that's my long-term project. I'm about halfway through. So hopefully 5 or 6 years' time, I have my confirmation course done, and that'll be fun. In terms of my own research, I am very interested in something called the second-person perspective, the I-thou relationship. And there was a Jewish philosopher called Martin Buber who kick-started this topic in the early 20th century. But what has put it onto an empirical basis is a study of conditions like autistic spectrum disorder. So autistic spectrum disorder, often children don't point very much. They don't engage in shared awareness or shared focus. And all these things are teaching us that this second person perspective is really important. And I think this is how we can understand nature and grace. And I'll use this as a metaphor. I must stress it's a metaphor. But I think with grace that we lose our spiritual autism to God. The spiritual autism we're all born with. And we move from just relating to God as in terms of a contract into a covenant where we and learn, and that whole Catholic life is really about that covenant with God, about shared awareness or shared focus with God. I want to give you an example of this: the Eucharist. In the Eucharist, what happens? We share awareness or shared focus with God. We love with God the things God loves, and we sacrifice with God what God sacrifices for our salvation. It's all about second person perspective. It's about the second person perspective.
You wrote a book. You wrote a book about that with in Aquinas' Ethics.
Yes, that's
Virtues
right.
And Gifts. Yeah. So Aquinas had something to say about that as well, does he?
Yes, and what was a real revelation was to find that he was writing in the 13th century about things that we're now uncovering in experimental psychology in the early 21st century.
Amazing.
But no one's made the connection previously. So it's like exploring an unknown world. And with a new toolkit. So it's exciting research. In fact, have a student joining me next year who's an F-16 pilot from the American Air Force, and he wrote to me a few days ago saying just how excited he was about all this work, and he could relate it to his pilot training as well. So you know, interesting connections that you would never imagine.
Wow. Well, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you today, Father. And for those who are interested in some of your books and writings, CTS, who publish Evangelium and the Lumen book we mentioned, also the Y course as well. And you've also written, you know, many other academic publications.
Yes,
as well.
The CTS also has two small booklets. I've written one on the theological virtues and one on the carnal virtues, and they bring in some of the second personal work. So they're quite a good introduction to that whole area.
Yeah, well, I'm really awestruck with just being such a privilege speaking with you today, Father. Thank you so much for your wisdom and insight. May God bless all the work that you're doing in Oxford, and very much look forward to this confirmation course on the Beatitudes.
Thank you. Please pray for me.
So thank you so much for the interview today. Yeah.
I thank you for your work, Robert, and I thank those of you who are watching or listening. And I hope to see some of you in heaven one day. That's hopefully all of you. So that's what I pray for. God bless you.
Thank you so much indeed, Father. God bless you.